Good afternoon. It's Wednesday of Holy Week. As we've done in the past, we divide Tuesday into Tuesday morning on Tuesday and then Tuesday afternoon on Wednesday because there's such an enormous amount of material to deal with. And also Wednesday is a day of preparation, a relative day of silence. It's also a day of betrayal, but we'll get to that at the end of our time together this morning. Yesterday, if you can remember where we were, the disciples and Jesus, after he's confronted an array of questioners trying to trip him up, trying to get him to say something they can use against him, they fail every time. As he's leaving the temple, he stops at the treasury where he makes the observation about proportional giving. The widow, having given all that she has, gave more than the person who gave a great deal of money, but it was a relatively small portion of what they had. They walk outside the temple. This temple is not Solomon's temple. It's actually, we could argue, the third temple in Judaism. There was the temple of Solomon. It's destroyed with the Babylonian captivity. Zerubbabel gets permission to return to Jerusalem and begins to working on the temple, trying to rebuild it. Nehemiah comes after him and begins rebuilding the wall. The temple that they're able to complete then is functional, but it's not a monument. It's nothing ornate. Herod, trying to build a sense of nationalism, which leaders always want to do because it breeds loyalty to the government, trying to build a spirit of nationalism and build a monument to himself, he embarks upon a massive expansion and rebuilding of the temple. Some would argue that perhaps Herod's temple exceeded Solomon's temple. It's a massive structure. Beautiful building. In fact, it's still undergoing expansion and renovation when Jesus is alive. It's not finished for a few more years. As they're walking out of the temple, the disciples are admiring this huge structure, larger than anything they would have found in Galilee or anything else they would have found in Judea. And again, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke primarily on this day. And they all have them saying pretty much the same thing. But let's read Mark. As Jesus was leaving the temple, Mark 13, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see all these great buildings?" Jesus says, "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." Wow. They could not imagine that sort of catastrophe befalling them as God's people, even though it's already happened once. The building exceeds any engineering marvel they probably have ever seen in their life. They just can't imagine this. As they walk away from the temple and walk outside the city gates and walk up on a hillside outside of the city where they can look back and see the temple, called the Mount of Olives. The 12 disciples, perhaps some others, sitting around there, and Peter, James, and John ask him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" Matthew adds the words, "Tell us when this will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age." That phrase in Matthew has led to a lot of, I think, unfortunate interpretations of what is sometimes called the Olivet prophecies, the teachings of Jesus on the Mount of Olives outside the city of Jerusalem on Tuesday afternoon. Jesus warns the disciples to be careful. Don't predict the future. Don't you try to predict the future. Then he goes on to give them some clues about when the temple will be destroyed. Again, following primarily Mark's passage, which Luke and Matthew follow Mark's outline, and by and large have similar wording. Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming I am he, and will deceive you. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Things must happen before the end. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. You'll be handed over to local councils and flogged in the synagogues." That happens not very long after he makes this prediction. 3 or 4 years later. Christianity is growing. They're being challenged. And certainly you read the book of Acts and Paul's encounters as well as others. You say they are called on to give an account of themselves. You'll be called before governors and kings as witnesses. Paul certainly was. The gospel must first be preached to all nations. Perhaps that's a metaphoric way of saying the gospel be preached to the Mediterranean basin. Though some traditions have disciples going as far as India, others going to the south, the north, and the east and west. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say what's given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. That has given rise to a lot of preachers not preparing to preach, just getting up and saying whatever comes to them. That's not at all what this is talking about. This is talking about a disciple, mature follower of Jesus, who because of their faith and their faithful living of that faith, are called to explain why they're acting like this. In that moment in time, there's no time for preparation, but their prior lifestyle has been a preparation for them to explain why they are living this way and acting this way. Then it says, brother will betray brother, father his child, children will rebel against their parents. Everyone will hate you because of me. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetops go down and enter the house to take anything out, but let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be for those pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world. If the Lord had not cut these days short, no one should survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. Wow. You read that, and many people want to project some sort of future prediction of the apocalypse or the end of time. Let me refer to you something that Jesus says to the disciples. He tells them that that they will live and will be able to see these things taking place. Some of you who are hearing these things will see these things happen. That's a significant clue that he is not talking about the parousia, the end of time, the second coming of Christ. He's talking about something that will occur in their lifetimes. In 70 AD, the Jews have become so rebellious and independent that the Romans send the legions, which would be the army. And they come with the intent of destroying the Jewish nation. And they pretty well succeed. The Roman armies come, they surround the city, they build a siege wall around the city so nobody can get out. And then they proceed to kill almost everybody. Now granted, this takes a period of time. But what he describes here, that those who are in Judea, which is where Jerusalem is located, flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetops go down and enter the house to take anything out of it. In other words, when you see the Roman legions coming, leave. Don't let them surround the city and form a barricade. Get out of town. How dreadful it would be in those days if you were pregnant or if you were nursing. It says it would be a horrible place. If anyone says, look, here's Messiah, look for it, don't believe it. There were false messiahs that were coming up and expressing themselves all the time, claiming that they were the true Messiah. Some had happened before Jesus, and some would come later, claiming to be the one. Now there is a short passage in here that talks about what probably is a reference to the second coming, which is something that's often the indefinite future. But the descriptions here, if you read the writings of Josephus, you find that the things that are described here occur almost exactly as Jesus said they would. Now, when I was in college, I read The Late Great Planet Earth. Probably still have a copy up here. Yes, I do still have a copy of The Late Great Planet Earth on my bookshelf. I was looking to my left, your right, to look where those books are in my library. And I was very convinced that this passage that I just read to you was talking about some yet to happen event. And it was very scary. It was exciting because you felt like you were figuring out the future. But we weren't. You know, this last year there have a lot of folks who said that, you know, this happened or that happens, and they take one scripture or two scriptures out of context and say, well, this is the end. Don't listen to that foolishness. Anyone who says they can predict when Jesus is coming is mistaken. Jesus says, I don't even know, only the Father in heaven knows. Now, what Jesus did predict actually happened. It literally came true. He speaks the words, and they're accurate, and they're truthful, and they're faithful, words that we can believe. He says, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. To me, that's the clincher. This generation, the people who are listening to his voice, they have all been dead for almost 2,000 years. There's no way to spiritualize that or make it to be something that it isn't. This is describing events, cataclysmic events. The nation of Israel is destroyed. It doesn't exist again until 1948, when the nation of Israel was reconstituted in the Middle East. So there was almost a 2,000-year break. No country, no nation. The Jews were dispersed around the world. They had no homeland. Jesus said this is going to happen. But it says no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be alert. Be prepared for the coming again. And then he gives a series of parables, primarily in Matthew. Parable of the guard, the faithful, unfaithful servants, the 10 virgins, the bags of gold, as he describes the necessity of being prepared. For while we do not know and never will know the day that the Lord will come again and that time will be no more, for any of us, any day, any moment could be the last moment we have. This last year we've lost people that are dear to us that we did not think were that sick or would die that quickly. But they did. Almost every day somewhere, well, excuse me, not every day, almost every day, but every day in the world, in our country, in our state, in our area, there are people who die young, people who die unexpectedly, people who die tragic deaths. There's no guarantee on life. There's no guarantee that we will see the sun go down today or the sun rise tomorrow. Almost all of us will, so it's easier for us to take life for granted. But be alert and be ready, whether the end comes to my life today, whether it comes tomorrow, the next day, whenever, or if I die and God has not come back, then I've been prepared, because we have no promises of tomorrow. Then while Jesus is telling these parables in Matthew, in chapter 25, he gives something that's a lot of folks' favorite story of Jesus about the end. You know, if you know the questions and the correct answers to a test, it makes taking that test a whole lot easier, doesn't it? Jesus here gives us the questions on the final exam and the answers on the final exam. He says, when the Son of Man comes, brings angels with him, sits on his glorious throne, he'll put the sheep on the right and the goat on his left. Hence the sheep and the goat judgment, as the name is given for that. The king will say to those on the right, come you who are blessed by my Father, and take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And the righteous will say, Lord, when did we do any of that? He says, when you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. To follow the King James wording. Profoundly significant scripture, because it tells us, as one of my New Testament professors in the seminary used to say, to be actively engaged in the task assigned. Again, here, just as we've seen on other days, Jesus' concern for the orphans, the poor, the widows, and how they were being taken advantage of, ignored, and harmed by the religious leadership. Here again, he says that's what's really important, is that your life as a Christian is expressed. Now, I should hasten to add that this is not to say that doing good deeds is what makes you right with God. It is being right with God that makes you able to perform good deeds. It is that sort of godly compassion that calls people to care for these who need clothes, who need food, who are in prison, and who are sick. This passage is inspired through the centuries, the creation of hospitals, children's homes, homes for orphans. In fact, the Christian church, some people sometimes say, well, what good has Christianity ever done? The first universities started in America were started by Christians because they believed in the value of education. Some of the first hospitals, certainly the hospitals for the poor, were started by guess who? The Christians. Who started orphanages, children's homes, to take care of those who had no one to take care of them? Christians did. This passage has been a great motivator and an example to Christians through the centuries to do the right thing and to help those who are in need. But then he turns to the folks on the left and he says, all the same circumstances. You didn't visit me. You didn't clothe me. You didn't feed me. You didn't help me. And they say, well, Lord, when did we ever see you and not do it? And he says, well, when you did not do it to the least of those among us, you didn't do it to me. You see, there's some folks who think that because they say they're Christians, they may come to church, they may try to act right on occasion, or they think that's all it is to be a believer. They don't see that it's a matter of inner transformation. That when you see the poor, the naked, the imprisoned, the hungry, what motivates you to do it in part or in large part is the fact that Christ lives within you, and you see these folks and your hearts are touched by them and you want to do something with them and to help them. With that, Jesus returns to Bethany. Sometime Tuesday night, the religious leaders have their meeting. Remember that morning Jesus had pretty well laid them out. And the crowds have agreed with what he said. And the religious leaders are afraid to attack him, to arrest him, or to kill him, which is their ultimate plan, because of his popularity. But that evening, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders, the elders, were gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. Later, Jesus spends the night. Wednesday spent as a day of preparation. He spent the night in Bethany again, home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Wednesday's the day of preparation for Passover. There's a lamb to be procured, to be prepared for the next day. There's a room to be secured in the city of Jerusalem so they can be in the city to observe Passover. That evening, he's at the home of Simon the leper. A woman comes with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. She pours it over his head. Some say, Mark and Matthew is very interesting. They say somebody said, could this not have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor? Jesus rebukes them, saying, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you'll always have, and you can help them anytime you want, but you'll not always have me. The poor will always be with you. It's not necessarily a prescription of Jesus that they're always going to be there. Don't worry about them. It's not that at all. It's in poor are going to always exist because of the way life is in this fallen world. But John finally chimes in. He's been quiet most of the week. But as he is writing his gospel 30 years after the other gospels are written, he chimes in now and starts adding his special material. The Synoptics and Acts, which were written by Luke, are fairly sympathetic to Judas. John will have none of that. He has no use for him. It's interesting, the disciple who was often described as the disciple of love, that Jesus loved, he loved Jesus, has no sympathy for Judas at all. In John's account, in John chapter 12, beginning probably verses 4 or 5, but one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected and said these things about why couldn't he have been given away to the poor. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. That's pretty sharp words for mild-mannered John. As a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should have perfume, save the perfume for this day of my burial. So again, John has no sympathy for Judas. Judas, apparently stung by the rebuke of Jesus, leaves Bethany, and it appears he makes his way to Jerusalem, where he goes to the house of Caiaphas and cuts a deal. He went to the chief priests and officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Matthew tells us they gave him 30 pieces of silver. And from that point, he looked for a time to betray Jesus. Again, when he's alone, when there's no crowd around, and they can arrest him without any retribution from the people. Well, what do we make about this Tuesday afternoon and the Wednesday night events we've discussed? How does that apply to us? Well, the Olivet prophecies, the discussion about the temple, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, gives me some confidence in knowing that Jesus accurately predicted this event happening, and that it marks a major turn as the Jewish nation is broken up to Gentiles or to Jews. Anyone who would believe and would follow would be the children of God. They would be the chosen ones, the elect, those who would say yes to God's offer. And that what Jesus said was true. Now, the greater lesson there is to be prepared but not preoccupied. Too many people are preoccupied with when is the end going to come and trying to figure out when Jesus is coming, and often the things I see in social media are really completely out of context, being twisted and used for some political means, political end, or just being spoken out of ignorance. The things Jesus predicted did in fact happen. He is in fact going to come again. We just can't predict when that will happen. If you become preoccupied with discovering when Jesus is going to come, you are destined to fail, because just surely as he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, he also said, you're not going to be able to figure this out. Why would we doubt him and his word on this subject? But it's easy to get caught into that. It's almost like getting caught into a conspiracy theory, trying to figure this out. It's a puzzle, it's a map. And how can you figure it out? You can't. It's a matter of faith. It's a matter of trust. So be prepared for Jesus to come. Be prepared for your life to end. But do not become preoccupied with that. And then, perhaps on an even more somber note, is what to do when you're disappointed in what God is doing in the world or in your life. Judas certainly was preoccupied or disappointed. The Synoptics would have us to believe that he was become disillusioned. There's a hint of a suggestion there that perhaps he hoped by doing this they would force Jesus to be whom he wanted to be. You just can't force God to do that. It could be that Judas was just simply a guy who got close to Jesus but never really got close to Jesus spiritually. But when you're disappointed with what's happening in your life and you think God's not doing what you want him to do, how you want him to do it, remember the cautionary tale of Judas. Don't think you can manipulate God to do something that you want God to do. And don't think that just because God's not doing it the way you want to do it, that you really have a better idea. It's a time for faith and it's a time for trust. Tomorrow we'll talk about Passover. We'll talk about Maundy Thursday. Tonight, this is Wednesday, so tonight at 6:30 we'll have Vespers as usual. Tomorrow night we will have communion. Tomorrow during the day we will talk about the events of Thursday, which really start in the late afternoon and go until midnight. So, I will talk to you tomorrow. Thank you and God bless.